fought for a more powerful and effective human rights commission. Since then, Ambassador Bolton served as a foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney during the 2012 race. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, an attorney at Kirkland Ellis, and a contributor to Fox News Channel. His op-ed articles are regularly featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. Ambassador Bolton was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and is a proud graduate of the McDonough School, our local Baltimore school. And without further ado, I'd like to call to the stage Ambassador Bolton.
Thanks for having me here tonight and to be back in Baltimore. I wanted to speak this evening about some of the challenges that the United States faces in the world and the policies that we're pursuing. Because I think it is an increasingly critical time for the United States and its allies in world affairs. And I think that the pace and the scope of the problems that we've been seeing and will see are going to increase in the coming years. And I think it's important to understand that the first problem we face when dealing with foreign and defense policy is the problem of the United States itself. And that is that for the first time, really, since Franklin Roosevelt, considering presidents Republican and Democrat alike, that the president doesn't place U.S. national security at the top of his list of priorities. In fact, the president really would rather not have to deal with foreign and defense policy issues. That makes it very different from that long line of presidents since Roosevelt, who first thought what threats does the United States face internationally. I think the president was very candid in the 2008 campaign as to what his priority was. He said in that campaign, his words, that he wanted to fundamentally transform America. And given that that's his objective, I think he sees national security issues as a distraction. He confronts when he has to, and has no real choice, where he can take political credit. And I think that has colored the national debate in a very significant way, and I think that problem that he has created has been affected by the Republican opposition as well, because by and large, as a collective matter, Republicans have not challenged the president on his failure to take national security issues more seriously, have not explained to voters that there's a complex relationship between domestic policy and international policy, and that the absence of a strong American presence in the world inevitably will undermine and compromise our liberty and way of life here at home. So that the joint effect of the president not paying much attention to national security and the Republicans not challenging on that point has been to lower the saliency of national security issues in the overall national political debate. I think that that impression that has been created internationally, therefore, is that you have an inattentive administration in Washington. And in watching the president has gone about conducting national security affairs, that the intention has been compounded by elements of the president's own philosophy that have contributed to the growing appearance and reality of American weakness in the world. And I'll just take two quick aspects of the president's view. Again, I think both of these distinguish him from presidents since Roosevelt. The first is the question of American exceptionalism. The president was asked on his first trip to Europe in 2009 if he believed in American exceptionalism. And his response was very interesting. He said, yes, I believe in American exceptionalism, just as the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. Now let's parse that sentence. In the first third, he says, yes, I believe in American exceptionalism, so all those people who say I don't are wrong. But then in the second two-thirds of the sentence, he takes it back. The Brits and the Greeks believe they're exceptional too, and why stop there? There are 193 members of the United Nations. He could have gone on to say, just as the Papua New Guineans believe in Papua New Guinean exceptionalism, just as the Burkina Fasans believe in Burkina Fasan exceptionalism, and on and on. So if everybody is exceptional, by definition, nobody is exceptional. And I think that's a very accurate assessment by the president himself. He's not the first person in American political life to hold those views, but he is the first one to be president. George H.W. Bush said of Michael Dukakis, for example, during the 1988 election, my opponent thinks of the United States as just another country out there somewhere on the UN roll call between Albania and Zimbabwe. So that there's this lack of faith in American exceptionalism and the strength of the interests that we have around the world. The second is that the president, I think, more than anybody in between, harkens back to Woodrow Wilson in the sense that he has an extraordinarily naive view of how other nations act in the world. And I think that's being demonstrated now in the case of Ukraine. I'll come to that in a minute. But listen to the president in his first speech to the UN General Assembly in September of 2009. It reflects as well his focus on his own administration as something different from other administrations that preceded it. He says, it is my deeply held belief that in the year 2009, more than at any point in human history, the interests of nations and peoples are shared. No world order that elevates one nation or group of people over another will succeed. No balance of power among nations will hold. Now that's a fairly extraordinary statement from somebody who had been in office all of about 8 months and had been serving at the national political of our government for only 4 years. But it's very similar to what Woodrow Wilson said during his presidency. He said, the interests of all nations are also our own. In his famous 14 points speech, he called for peace without victory. And Wilson said, there must be not a balance of power, but a community of power. Not organized rivalries, but an organized common peace, founded on the moral force of the public opinion of the world. Now, very interesting commentary from Wilson, and certainly sounds a lot like Obama. And I think that the fallacies that are inherent in the Wilsonian view of the world, the notion that somehow there aren't adverse interests, that there aren't clashes over issues that are important to people, whether it's territory, population, resources, religion, culture, ideology, or any combination of those factors, and that indeed what we want is not a balance of power, but a community of power, said Wilson. And he wasn't even a community organizer. So the impression, I think, that Obama gives to the world is somebody who is, one, inattentive, and two, terribly naive. And I think that the impression that Obama gives is reflected in the range of policy challenges that we face in the United States, and we'll see, have seen played out, and we'll see play out in the remaining 3 years of his term. And I'd just like to touch on a few of what I think are the most significant, two at the level of grand strategy, and two more immediate and more threatening in the short term. First, at the strategic level, is how to deal with Russia. The administration came into office saying relations with Russia are really terrible because of the bad Bush administration. And we're going to press the reset button, that was their phrase, and relations with Russia will improve. And what the administration did in its very early days was give up missile and radar sites in Poland and the Czech Republic that were intended to be foundation blocks for the limited national missile defense program that the Bush administration launched. The Obama team entered into the New START arms control agreement, an agreement to reduce deployed nuclear warheads very substantially and to put Russia and America back at an even level, something that we had been able to break in the previous administration, and an agreement that doesn't reflect the huge disparity between the United States and the world and Russia. The United States has allies all over the world who have depended on our nuclear umbrella. Russia, up until the past month or so, had one treaty ally in the world, that's Belarus, if you want it. And yet the administration agreed to parity in terms of nuclear weapons. The administration made many other concessions, which the Kremlin, in a true Soviet-era negotiating style, put in their pocket, and then turned and said, what have you got for us now? And despite the reset button, despite a series of complications, we now confront the crisis in Ukraine, a crisis that was entirely foreseeable and indeed was foreseen during the Bush administration. In April of 2008, the Bush administration put to the other members of NATO the proposal that Ukraine and Georgia be put on a clearly defined fast track toward NATO membership. The Europeans, fearful of the Russian response, rejected the proposal, and 4 months later, in August of 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. What was the response of candidate Barack Obama to this conflict between Russia and Georgia? He said both sides should exercise restraint. Now, I'm sure that that is written in all kinds of ways inside the Kremlin, that a man could look at a situation like the attack by the Russian army, which came to within a few miles of the Georgian capital, which bombed targets right up to the city limits, and called on Georgia to do the same thing that he wanted Russia to do, exercise restraint. I think the Kremlin saw that for what it was, and I think it's exploiting exactly that insight in Ukraine today. What has been the response of the president? He's had several conversations with Vladimir Putin, where, according to the White House description of the conversations, he has admonished Putin that the deployment of Russian military forces in the Crimea is a violation of international law. Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure Putin is saying to himself, what planet does this man live on? You know, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is such that the electorate of the Ukraine is very closely balanced in terms of its political inclinations. And clearly what Putin is doing is negotiating in that same old Soviet-era style. He's putting his boot on Ukraine's neck and then saying, let's negotiate. And our response, including reports from today, has been to reject Ukrainian requests for military assistance. We are instead sending John Kerry to Geneva to negotiate with Sergei Lavrov. This isn't even going to be fun to watch because the outcome is essentially foreordained. We have taken the path that the Europeans wanted us to, the path of least resistance, and the Russians have moved to fill the strategic vacuum. I personally don't think that Putin is going to be satisfied with hiving off the Crimea from Ukraine. I think he still thinks he can play for the whole thing. He clearly is following through on his observation the last time he was president of Russia, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It's apparent that he wants to recreate Russian hegemony within the space of the former Soviet Union. Ukraine is the big prize, and he's well on the way to doing exactly that. I think for him, partition is plan B. I don't think he's going to have to settle for that because I don't think the Europeans or the Obama administration have the stomach to do anything about it. And I think every other former republic of the Soviet Union recognizes that if Putin can tip Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, they too are vulnerable. And that includes NATO members like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So here's an example of an administration that came in months after Russian troops crossed an international border into Georgia for the first time since the breakup of the Soviet Union, watched the United States and Europe collectively do nothing, and spent 5 years assiduously avoiding thinking about what the consequences of that were. It's not Obama's actions in the past month that have represented failure. It's his inattention to the issue for 5 years that represents failure. And it's a reflection of his inability to understand what motivates Russia, broadly speaking internationally, as he has continuously misunderstood them in Syria, where both Secretary of State Clinton and Secretary of State Kerry have said repeatedly that we share a common interest with Russia in a smooth transition of the Assad regime out of power. That has never been Russia's interest. Assad is their only Arab ally, not counting now that they're selling weapons to Egypt for the first time in 40 years because of the Obama administration's mishandling of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. But there was never a chance that Russia shared interest with us in how to resolve the Syria conflict. So this is yet another piece of evidence at the strategic level that Obama is woefully unprepared, even after 5 years, to deal with this kind of challenge. And the Ukraine is important, not just for Ukraine, of course, not just for the former Soviet Union. Other than the participants in the Ukraine crisis themselves, the nation that is most closely watching what is happening in Ukraine today is China. Because China sees the inability or unwillingness of the United States and Europe to do much of anything other than propose pinprick sanctions against Russia, and calculates, I'm sure, that the assertive, almost belligerent territorial claims that China has made in the East China Sea and the South China Sea are now much closer to fulfillment than they ever could have imagined. In both the State Department and, unfortunately, many circles of American business, people have the idea that China is engaged in a peaceful rise and it will be a responsible stakeholder, that's the buzz phrase, in world affairs. That is a possible scenario for China. It's probably the most desirable scenario from the American point of view, but it's not inevitable, and it's probably not even the most likely scenario. China has engaged in a significant military buildup, although it's slimmed down the number of troops under arms. It's greatly improved the sophistication of their weapons and lethality. China has dramatically increased its nuclear warhead stockpile and its ballistic missile capability. It has one of the top 2 or 3 cyber warfare capabilities on the planet. It has sophisticated anti-satellite weapons to take out American intelligence and communications capabilities in the event of hostilities. China is building a blue water navy for the first time literally in 600 years, and it is producing very sophisticated area denial and anti-access weapons like anti-ship cruise missiles to push the United States Navy back from the shores of the Western Pacific. A task made easier as the United States Navy shrinks. We now have at sea about 285 ships, a level not seen since 1916. Think about that. 1916, as the President proposes to reduce our standing Army capability to a level not seen since 1940. Another year of great peace and stability in the world. The fact is that China understands that in the South China Sea, in a confrontation with competing territorial claimants like Vietnam or the Philippines or others, that one-on-one there's no contest. The only potential to resolve these issues in a way that's not entirely to China's satisfaction is if the United States is an active participant, as we are more likely to be with Japan in contesting China's claims in the East China Sea. The consequence of China being able to take the South China Sea and transform it from an international waterway into a Chinese lake, which is the stated Chinese intention, and which they have been implementing not just through military activity, but by setting up civil administrative structures that would rule over this territory. The effect would be to make international waters into a Chinese lake. And virtually all the sea commerce, other than trans-Pacific shipping, that goes to South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan goes through the South China Sea. So converting those waters into territorial waters of China puts China's hands on Japan's windpipe. And everybody there knows it. What is the administration's policy to deal with these Chinese territorial claims? Call for the peaceful resolution of the territorial disputes through negotiation. That's like saying our policy is prayer, because it's just about that effective. And the impression that it gives to Beijing is that they are in a clearly dominant position. So China, like Russia, is another example of the administration simply not having a strategic understanding of the challenges that we face or a strategy that America could follow. And this failure is repeated at the level of the two immediate threats that I want to talk about, the continuing threat of international terrorism and efforts to counter the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological. We have seen yet another textbook example of the administration's view of how to deal with international problems in the case of Iran, arguing that, as the President said in his inaugural address in 2009, that the United States would extend an open hand if only Iran would unclench its fist. And the administration points to the agreement signed in Geneva in November among 5 permanent members of the Security Council in Germany on the one hand and Iran on the other as an example of its successful negotiation. So let's examine this as a case study and see what it proves. Number one, the administration opposed most of the economic sanctions measures that were put in place against Iran, that it now argues brought Iran to the table. But what is it exactly that they discussed once they sat at the table? And what was the effect of the economic sanctions? The administration's own Director of National Intelligence testified last year that the economic sanctions had not slowed Iran's nuclear weapons program down at all, an assessment that has been voiced by the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency as well. In fact, Iran came to the negotiating table to talk about getting relief from the sanctions. That's what the sanctions produced. And they succeeded. They succeeded in getting relief from the sanctions without any commensurate concessions regarding their nuclear weapons program. The steps that Iran agreed to take were superficial, transitory, easily reversible, and it had no material impact on the program itself, assuming, a heroic assumption I might add, that we know everything about their nuclear weapons program and that they've not been successful in concealing anything from us. By contrast, the Geneva Agreement represented not merely a substantial economic breakthrough for Iran, but a huge psychological victory, as the entire impression about the potential risks and costs of doing business with Iran was turned on its ear. The sanctions are now lifted in most respects. They were very hard to put back in place. Certainly there will be no effort to do that as long as negotiations continue. This is a strategy that Iran used very successfully 10 years ago when Hassan Rouhani, the new president of Iran, was their chief nuclear negotiator. Negotiations are like any other human activity. They have costs as well as benefits. And countries come into negotiations with advantages and with objectives. Iran's play has been more time to finish the work that it needs to get a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. And the fact is that Iran's work on its nuclear weapons program, not just the enrichment, but the weaponization aspects and its ballistic missile program have continued unabated. And we just see the news of the past week that Iran and Russia have signed an agreement for the construction of 2 further nuclear power plants, like the one the Russians built at Bushehr, that over time, and not much time, will give Iran an alternative route to nuclear weapons by reprocessing the plutonium and the spent fuel from these reactors. So Iran's view is that they have achieved what they wanted to achieve at little or no cost, and I think that impression is widely shared throughout the Middle East, not just in Israel, but in the oil-producing Arab countries of the Gulf region as well. I think right now the most likely outcome is that Iran gets nuclear weapons essentially at the time of its choosing. The only thing that will stand in the way of that is a preemptive military strike. The administration says all options are on the table. Nobody believes that. Nobody believes that. Nobody believes Barack Obama will use force against Iran's nuclear weapons program. The Israelis don't believe it, and even more importantly, the Iranians don't believe it. So that's why the spotlight is on Israel. I don't know what they will do, but I do know that twice in their history, once against Saddam Hussein in 1981, and in September of 2007 against Syria, Israel has struck at nuclear weapons programs in hostile states. So I think we will see sooner rather than later what Israel is going to do. If they don't strike, then you can count on Iran with nuclear weapons. And I think the effects of that for America, for its Arab allies in the region, as well as for Israel, risks being catastrophic. In part because of the relationship of Iran to terrorism, the last point I want to cover. After the 9/11 attack, we had no hesitation in overthrowing the Taliban and their al-Qaeda affiliates in Afghanistan. But imagine if Afghanistan had nuclear weapons. Imagine the Taliban had nuclear weapons. What would our response have been? Not necessarily the same. Iran, for 30-plus years, has been the world's central banker of international terrorism. And if they achieve deliverable nuclear weapons, they may well have accomplished impunity against retaliation for terrorist attacks that they arm, finance, and frame. That is a huge game changer, even without Iran actually using the nuclear weapons that it would possess. And it's in that very important sense that the Obama administration's reaction to terrorism has been so detrimental. The president doesn't want to treat it as a war against terrorism. He wants to treat it as a law enforcement matter. This paradigm was the paradigm the United States followed before 9/11. When we saw the terrorist attacks of the 1980s, the Lockerbie bombing in December of 1988, the attacks, the first attack on the World Trade Center, the attack on the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, the attacks on the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the attacks on the USS Cole, and other attacks around the world, all were treated as law enforcement. The case of the attack on the Cole is particularly interesting. Here's an American warship in Yemen attacked by suicide bombers, and the Clinton administration sends in the FBI. Well, I'm glad the Pentagon is protected by the FBI. I'm sure that really gave them a warm feeling. And the result in treating terrorism like a law enforcement matter was 9/11. And here we are, we're a little bit over 12 years since 9/11, when everybody understood that we didn't want this war, but the terrorists had brought it to us, and we're back to law enforcement. This view of how you deal with terrorism is it is such a fundamental misreading of the threat we face that it's very hard to predict the consequences. But we've seen how the administration's action sets up the potential negative consequences. And despite Secretary of State Clinton's observation about Benghazi, her rhetorical question, what difference it makes at this point, here's what difference it makes. The terrorist attack in Benghazi on September the 11th, 2012, is an issue you can debate from many different perspectives. What we failed to do before the attack, what we could have done or not done as the attack occurred, and what we should have done after the attack. And that's really what I want to mention here. The fact is that killing an American ambassador in a foreign country is a hugely important political act. The ambassador is not simply the person who oversees a large staff of State Department people and Defense Department people and intelligence people and agriculture people and commerce people. The ambassador from the United States to a foreign country is the personal representative of the President of the United States. And that's very well understood. When an American ambassador rides through a capital city, the American flag flies on the right front fender of their limousine. So what we saw in Benghazi is that the terrorist attacked the personal representative of the president, killed him, and got away with it. What that tells you about Barack Obama is that you can murder his personal representative and do it with impunity. 18 months later, no action has been taken. And the lesson it sends to the terrorists and their state sponsors is a very, very grim one for the United States. And it's a lesson our adversaries in states see as well. And it's a lesson our friends see as well. So that's why I think that the pace and the scope of challenges to the United States will increase over the next 3 years. People see a weak administration, an inattentive administration, an administration who would rather do almost anything other than national security affairs. You know, they say you get the kind of government you deserve. Well, this is the government we've got for 3 more years, and it raises the question for all of us as citizens, if this is really the kind of national security policy we want. We can't blame anybody other than ourselves. I think if we don't have a clear debate on America's role in the world for the 2016 election, we are putting ourselves in grave peril. The Obama administration view is very clear. The United States is too strong, too assertive, too much in the world. We're part of the problem. Our strength is provocative. That's his view. I think that's like looking at the world through the wrong end of the telescope. I think what's provocative is American weakness. And we've got a very provocative president now. I think that policy needs to change in 2016, and I think that's an issue that must be debated in the next presidential election. Thank you very much. And I'd be delighted to answer questions about anything that I covered in the speech or everything that I left out, which is an even longer list. So, shall we start over here?
Yep. Hi, Ambassador. Thanks for coming. You mentioned Obama's failure to stand up for America's interests around the world, and specifically with respect to Ukraine and rejecting the proposal for military assistance. I'm not exactly sure what you would expect Obama, what you want Obama to do that wouldn't cause escalation or other significant problems.
Well, let me ask you a question in turn, if I could. Are you prepared to see a Russian-dominated government in Kiev with all of the implications that that entails?
No, so I don't know what the solution is, but I'm wondering what your proposal would be.
Well, my proposal would be to say to the government in Ukraine, basically what Bush proposed in 2008, that I would be prepared to bring a democratic Ukraine very quickly into NATO. The mistake that was made, and it really covers 3 administrations, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, is that as the Soviet Union collapsed and as NATO expanded east, we left a vacuum where represented by Ukraine and Georgia. NATO made the clear decision, with no dissent in this country as far as I can see, to admit Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But by not finishing the job, we invited the kind of political vacuum that we see now. I don't think this is a question of Ukraine's integration economically into Europe. The European Union isn't going to provide Ukraine or anybody else with any security. The issue is whether NATO is prepared to do what NATO alone can do. And that's why I do fault Obama for the past 5 years. We saw what happened at the Bucharest summit. It was the end of the Bush administration, and there wasn't much more he could do. But for 5 years, Obama has let this vacuum exist and not done a thing about it, and now we're paying the price for it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Many countries across Europe and Australasia have a better track record when it comes to human rights than the US, are performing admirably better than the US economically, and also have somewhat strong militaries as well. So please humor me and encourage my
Just tell me which ones those are.
encourage my ignorance. Why is America exceptional?
Because America, almost alone among the countries of the world, was founded and has developed based on principles of individual liberty. And we have stood for it and defended it around the world in ways that no other country has. It's not saying America is better, but it's very definitely saying America is different.
Yeah, you spent a lot of time criticizing the president and Democratic leadership. You devoted most of your speech to that.
It's a Democratic president, just to be clear.
For not being, I guess, zealous enough on issues of national security, American exceptionalism, etc. You said that Obama, quote, couldn't care less about threats to U.S. national security. My question is, how would you respond to people that say you are a demagogue whose rhetoric is intended to scare people into supporting U.S. militarism?
Thank you. I tried to give you an analog speech. I think the president's a weak leader. I think he's failed at national security issues. And I think that the evidence for that is overwhelming. If there's contrary evidence, let's hear it. If you want to attack me, that's fine. I enjoy it. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you for your speech. I have a question that is not about your view. I agree with everything you said. It's about reaction of Obama to Iran's case when in the uprising of 2010. I'm thinking that the principle of the president of the U.S. should be either promoting democratic states, which we didn't see in the case of it should be either resisting religious states, which we didn't see in the case of Egypt, or promoting democratic states, which we could say Egypt was reacted to in that way. But what was the principle of Obama's almost total silence in reaction to Iran when the uprising occurred?
Well, I think American foreign policy should be based on protecting American interests. Wilson, to come back to him, was famous for saying that he thought we should make the world safe for democracy. And Theodore Roosevelt responded to that by saying, first, we should make the world safe for ourselves. That is the basic principle. And looking case by case at countries around the world, you should adopt the policy to protect American interests in light of the circumstances you face. So in the case of Iran, Here you had in summer of 2009, as I think in 2005, a clearly fraudulent election where the Ahmadinejad was elected and then re-elected in dubious circumstances, to say the least. 2009, people go into the streets. They're average middle-class Iranian students. They have no weapons. And they are gunned down by the Revolutionary Guard and the besieging militia. Our administration says essentially nothing. Why is that, you ask? Because I think Obama thought that if he criticized the regime, his chances of negotiating with them on the nuclear weapons program would drop to zero. And that was his principal objective. If he offended the regime over their human rights record, he wouldn't get a chance to make the deal that he's just made in November. I think it was delusional to think that you could negotiate the mullahs out of their nuclear weapons program to begin with, but I think that's what was on his mind. In Egypt, you know, we have had a policy in the past 3 years that has effectively alienated every major element of Egyptian society. The pro-democracy liberals think we utterly failed to help them at the moment of the downfall of the Mubarak government. The military thinks we supported the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood thinks we supported the military. The rest of the Arab world looks at how we treated Mubarak, where by my count, in the 30-day period surrounding the demonstrations in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, we had, by my count, 4 distinct positions on what should happen to Mubarak. First, that he should stay, then that he should go, then that he should stay in power till the end of the year, and then he should go, in the words of Robert Gibbs, the press secretary, should go yesterday. Other Arab governments, the oil-producing monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, looked at the way we treated Mubarak, who had consistently upheld the Camp David Accord with Israel during his tenure in office after Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by whom? The Muslim Brotherhood. But the other Arabs saw that this defender of the Camp David Accord was thrown under the bus, and they said to themselves, in our time of trouble, what happens to us? So it was a policy that of almost complete failure, and as I said a moment ago, has opened Egypt to Russian weapon sales for the first time since the early 1970s. It's hard to imagine how we could have done worse. Okay.
Hi, thank you for coming. My question is regarding Syria. When it became evident that chemical weapons were being used there, and that it crossed what Obama said was a red line, nothing really was done. What would, if you were in charge, what do you think the correct action should have been?
Right. Well, I favored in 2003 and 2004 not the use of military force, but the use of the fact that we had 400,000 troops in Iraq to take care of both the Assad regime in Syria and to get serious about the Ayatollahs in Iran. We didn't take advantage of that opportunity. In fact, many of the people who are now at the upper levels of the Obama administration told us again and again that Assad was somebody we could deal with. They refused to see what was going on once the opposition in Syria had grown. I think there was a very limited opportunity, and maybe an impossibly small opportunity, to support the opposition against Assad. In any event, we didn't take that opportunity if it existed. And we've now got a conflict, this grinding, deadly civil war that's going to go on with virtually no prospect of stopping, in my view, and where at the present time, there's no side that supports American interests. There's nothing good you can say about the Assad regime. There's obviously no way we're going to support Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and other terrorist affiliates. And frankly, the rest of the opposition looks a lot like the Muslim Brotherhood to me. I think the central problem that the administration faced in Syria was analogous to the way they treated the opposition in Iran in 2009. They knew that if we went after Assad in a major way, that we would be removing an Iranian surrogate, and that would tank any possibility of negotiations with Tehran over the nuclear weapons program. Now again, that is chasing an illusion, but I think that's what dominated their thinking, and it highlights what I think the real issue is. The problem is not really Syria. That is a manifestation of the larger problem, which is the regime in Iran. And unless we're prepared to say we want regime change in Iran, the Middle East is going to remain troubled for as far as the eye can see. Yeah.
Ambassador, I agree with much of what you've said this evening. One thing I do not agree with is your opposition to the New START Treaty. And I say that not because I think that the United States in general should have equal influence in the world as Russia, but specifically because I think if we have both sides have way, way, way too many nuclear weapons. The United States currently has 5,100 nuclear warheads. Do you think that the human race could survive the detonation of 5,100 nuclear warheads? And if not, what's the purpose of having them?
Well, the main purpose of having them is to prevent other nuclear powers and or rogue states from thinking that they can get away with the use of nuclear weapons. And it's not a happy prospect, but unless you can roll science back, which isn't going to happen, the question is, has the U.S. nuclear capability brought more stability to the world than not? And I think the answer to that is clear, that it has. That it provided that stability during the Cold War, and it provided a critical element of stability in the form of the American nuclear umbrella that allowed us to say to effectively every other country over which we had any sway, you're not going to build nuclear weapons because you can count on us. We stopped nuclear weapons programs in country after country, Taiwan and South Korea and elsewhere. Now, as the American nuclear deterrent is called into question, it provides, even for our allies, unfortunately, a strong incentive to get their own nuclear capability. And if you believe, as I do, that the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the possibility somebody's going to use them first. This is a very, very dangerous circumstance. We're down now, I think, to historically dangerously low levels of nuclear capability. And even worse, since we haven't tested a warhead since the early 1990s, we have to worry that both the reliability and the safety of the nuclear stockpile is deteriorating. One nuclear scientist said to me, having all these nuclear warheads is like having 10,000 Toyotas in a garage. You want every one of them to start when you turn the key the first time, and you don't want any of them to start before you turn the key. And the only way we were able to determine that before was through testing, which we haven't done in 20 years. So I think the treaty has had a very detrimental effect on the United States. It's allowed Russia, they couldn't sustain a nuclear force above 1,500. I mean, they had a lot of warheads too, but theirs are turning into green cheese. They have used their oil revenue to build up, modernize their ballistic missile force, to refit their nuclear warheads. I suspect they are doing it illegally at low levels, while ours has continued to deteriorate. So I think the situation that we have now is that our nuclear umbrella is untested, that it's filled with loopholes, and that the security that it's provided is greatly diminished.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Truman Zhang. I'm a doctoral student in the Policy Department. You mentioned that China is a threat to the U.S. Personally, I don't agree with you, but assume you are right, China is a threat. So what do you suggest U.S. should do? Are you suggesting U.S. will have a war with China?
Well, the objective is not to have a war with China. In fact, what worries me most about the circumstances in the East and South China Sea is that the risk of miscalculation has increased. Because the perception of American weakness is an inducement to China to take on countries like the Philippines and Vietnam that can't possibly resist in any effective way. Or to get one of China's clear objectives, which is hegemony over Taiwan. And I think this is a very risky period for Taiwan, among other countries. You know, in the late 1990s, China put a substantial number of missiles and heavy bombers along the coast on the Chinese side of the Taiwan Strait, clearly making a military threat toward Taiwan. The Clinton administration sent 2 carrier battle groups toward Taiwan to make it clear to China that they weren't going to be able to take advantage of Taiwan. And I've asked this question a number of times. How many people think, little audience participation, how many people think, if faced with a similar threat to Taiwan today, that the Obama administration would do what Clinton did and send 2 carrier battle groups steaming toward Taiwan? How many people think he would do that? I've asked this question a million times. You are the first person to put your hand up. Nobody thinks Obama would come to Taiwan's defense. Now, if we can figure that out, don't you think they can figure that out in Beijing? Beijing doesn't want a war over Taiwan. It wants Taiwan to fall into its lap like a ripe fruit. And I think we're in jeopardy of that happening in the next 3 years, because the window is open for sure only that period of time. We'll see what happens.
Sorry, my question is what you guys should do in the future to deal with China. It's not about
I think to make it clear, let's just take the South China Sea. I would have a much more, number one, I'd have a bigger Navy. But you can't get a bigger Navy quickly. It takes time to build a ship. But I would put a much greater priority to American war vessels steaming through the international waters of the South China Sea. And I would make it clear that we will stand with the Philippines and the mutual defense agreement we have with them over the territory they claim there, that we would stand with Japan and we would consider the Senkaku Baitai Islands as part of the mutual defense agreement we have with Japan. I would reject the air defense identification zone that China's established in the East China Sea. I would sail through that. I would tell American Airlines, as the Japanese and South Koreans have done, not to give the Chinese notification. In other words, I would say we reject your territorial claims, and we intend to prove it. I think that show of strength would back Beijing down. Yeah.
We're actually going to go ahead and ask a question from Twitter, which came from down at SICE. And the question was, given the stabilization fund that was established by President Vladimir Putin years ago, do you think that he has enough money to fight off sanctions from the West?
Yes, I do. And I think in part because I think the sanctions that have been proposed are insignificant. For example, Europe may or may not announce on Monday, and we may or not announce on Monday after the referendum in the Crimea, that we're going to freeze the funds of certain named Russian individuals in European and American banks. Now, we've been talking about this for 3 weeks. How many of you really think that those funds are just sitting around waiting to be frozen? The Russians have announced as well they will take economic sanctions against us. And I think the willpower of the Europeans to have sustained economic sanctions when they're still dependent on Russian oil and gas is tenuous, to say the least. The argument has been that if we integrate Russia or integrate China into the international economic order, that our influence over Russia and China will increase all to the good. And it turns out, economics works both ways. If there's a radical thought for you, that actually it may have increased Russia and China's influence over us. So that you can't count on the integration to have the effect that you want. And in any event, I'm not sure that the people proposing the sanctions have the willpower to carry them through or the attention span to do it for a long enough period of time.
And for the sake of time, we're actually going to take the last 2 questions from each side. But if you are not able to ask a question right now, we invite you to join us upstairs for the reception. Thanks, guys. Sorry.
Ambassador Bolton, I would like to ask about what you said about the American exceptionalism. Is that the foundation or key to America defining its role in the world? 2, the belief in American exceptionalism within the US, is it on the decline? Obviously, the current leaders do not believe in it.
Well, I don't think it's on the decline among the American population as a whole. I think if you took a poll of faculty lounges at America's great universities, 90% of them would agree with Barack Obama. That's part of the discontinuity between American higher education and the real country. But I do think that American exceptionalism has been something that has been present for a long time. You know, this is not, people don't understand where this comes from. It wasn't America that decided it was exceptional itself. It was the way it developed. And the first person to comment on American exceptionalism was, of all people, a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, who said the circumstances of the American people make them exceptional, and it may be that no other people in the world will ever be that way. That is a reflection of the difference of the evolution of the United States from other countries. You know, the definition of nationalism in Europe, according to another Frenchman whose name escapes me at the moment, was terre et sang, earth and blood. In America, that formulation of the definition of nationalism was reversed. This is a nationalism based on an idea, based on a collection of ideas, and I do think that's different from other longer, more historically based civilizations. It doesn't make them inferior or superior, it just makes us different.
Could I just follow up? Are you therefore saying there's a disconnect between the elites of America and the general population of America in the belief in American exceptionalism?
Yes, I think there is a discontinuity, and I think there has been for some time. I graduated from college in 1970, and it was acute then. I don't think it's changed much since then, and I think it's a real tribute to the American people that they've ignored college professors for so long.
With respect to your comment about America's defense of individual liberties across the world, do you believe that America should have acted differently when Bahraini civilians protested peacefully against the government and were subsequently killed, tortured, and imprisoned by the regime?
No, I don't. And I think what I said before was in response to the question of Iran, that our policy internationally has to be to protect American interests, the fundamental interest being the liberty of the people of the United States. That doesn't mean we are therefore the human rights guarantor of every other country in the world, because otherwise we would exhaust ourselves. The issue in a case like Bahrain is what it means for the strategic stability of the United States and its friends and allies. And there's no doubt in my mind that while there are legitimate grievances among the Shia majority, 70% of the population of Bahrain, that is also seen by Iran as the key to getting influence on the southern shore of the Persian Gulf and dominating all of the oil production there. And it's going to be one of the consequences when Iran gets nuclear weapons, because it will be able to dominate the countries on the other shore of the Gulf. People worry if Israel attacks, what will happen to the price of oil? Imagine this scenario. Iran gets nuclear weapons, it says to Kuwait, it says to Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi. Let's all cut oil production by 50% and get the price up internationally. Faced with the nuclear Iran, what are they going to do? If you don't like Iran's behavior under the Ayatollahs now, imagine how much worse it would be once they get nuclear weapons. And if you think the human rights record of Bahrain is bad, check it out with Iran. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Please join us upstairs for a reception by the College Republicans. They have Charm City Cupcakes, so meet upstairs. Thank you all for joining us. Those who are not here at campus, we love that you guys can be able to view us, and we hope to see you or hear from you next time, March 26th, Cornell West. Thank you.